Well, Kari, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Parenting podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I know I'm looking forward to talking to you about your son and Brody but I like to start with ourselves because there's so much of us in this. And I'm wondering for you, how were you raised and what was your childhood like?
Well, if it's any indication, I've heard it said that the quality of the relationship with your parents is how far away you live from them as an adult. And I lived 3 blocks away from my parents. I had a great upbringing. We were a small family, just my sister and myself, and my parents. Very traditional. We sat down to dinner every single night around the dining room table. My dad was very big on family time, so we would go to the lake every weekend and spend time together. And they've just been influential from a business standpoint. My dad was always kind of my work hero, and my mom was kind of just my personality hero. She was always optimistic, and so it was kind of funny when I was pregnant with my son, we looked at a house that was 3 blocks away from my parents. And I looked at my husband, I'm like, there's no way you're going to want to live that close, are you? And he said, well, if we have a kid, it's going to be really helpful. And it has been. So it's been wonderful because they've been hugely influential in Brady's life. They are so close to him. And if they go more than a few days without seeing him, it's hard for all of them involved. So
That's so
it's
nice.
it
Oh,
is. I know. I'm
man,
kind
many
of
of the
one of
listeners
those.
are jealous, I think, right
I
now.
know. I'm one of those rare stories. So it was a great way to grow up in a great place with people who really had moral integrity and values, and turned my sister and I into hardworking people too. So I love them to pieces.
Great. Wow. That's really nice. Often we're reacting against sometimes, and that's nice to know that there's so many wonderful values and practices and things that you really want to keep going with your own family.
Absolutely.
That's really beautiful. So your son Brady has been diagnosed with autism. When did you discover that he was a neurodivergent kid? How did you realize that any kind of differences he had might be something, more than just normal developmental differences?
Right. Well, even as a very young child, we would go to mommy and me classes. And, they always want you to sit around in a circle and sing the song when everybody
Yeah.
gets there with your kid in your lap. And Brady wanted nothing to do with that. He was always in the corner of the room, rolling around on his back. And, the kids would be on the bouncy mat, and Brady would be trying to figure out how the hose fit together with the motor for the blow up thing. So he was always just kind of on the fringe of where the other kids were. And I used to joke, we'd go to play dates and Brady would be as far away from other kids as possible. And it was impacting my ability to have conversations with the moms and build relationships. So
Sure.
I would joke that I was going to hire a babysitter to come to play dates because I wasn't getting a chance to bond with the other moms. But still, I hadn't been around kids that much. So I didn't really have a point of comparison for him.
Yeah. It's all new,
And
of course.
it was all new, and he was fine with us. He seemed typical around our family. He was comfortable around my husband and me and my family and my mother-in-law. But when he got to preschool, we really started to notice that the other kids were running off and playing with each other. They were making friends. We had an amazing preschool teacher who sent home probably 50 pictures a day of what they did during
Wow.
the class. And Brady was never with the other kids. Again, if they had circle time, Brady was in the back of the room. So finally, it was really it all came together almost in a waterfall. One day I dropped him off. He had been having some major problems with potty training at the time. I asked the teacher, are other kids having these problems? And she said, no, not really. And I asked her about him not being with the class. And she said, yeah, he usually wants to be away. But when we call him back, he's very good about it. And he'll come and sit for a few minutes before he goes away. And that day I got home from school and I picked up a magazine that was just a local kind of social free edition that they send out. And there was an article in it by a woman named Patty Dion, whose son was diagnosed with Asperger's in his 30s. And she talked about kind of his peculiarities as a child, his inability to make friends. And it just started to well up that, oh my goodness, this might be what Brady has. And at the bottom of that article, there was a quiz that I went online and I took, and I answered yes to every single question on the quiz. And it just hit me like a freight train that my son was autistic, and I didn't know how to verbalize that to my husband or to my parents or anything else, but I just knew on a completely full body level that that's exactly what was going on with Brady. So it kind of was a very slow build at first, but then when I put those pieces together, it was just apparent. And we honestly started therapies for him before we even had a diagnosis, because it took quite a while to get in to see a developmental pediatrician and a psychologist to try to get the formal diagnosis. It was several months, and we just kind of started scrambling and trying to pull things together based on other parents' advice.
So can I ask you about your initial reaction to sort of taking this quiz and having this realization? I mean, did you feel relief? Were you sad? Were you grieving? What was it, all of that? What was going on for you as you realized that this was possibly your son's diagnosis?
I was devastated. It was not relief because I didn't know anything about autism. I didn't know anything. They don't even really diagnose Asperger's anymore, but Asperger's is a more verbal form of autism. And I did not know what that meant for my son, for his future. I didn't know whether he would be able to go to school with other kids. Ironically, about 3 weeks before this happened, we were playing at a trampoline park with my best friend and her girls, and there was an incident where a boy came up to my friend's daughter and grabbed her by the back of the head and slammed her head into the glass wall. And she wasn't really hurt, but I remember grabbing her and picking her up, and there was a dad that ran up onto the platform and he said, I'm so sorry. He doesn't know what he's doing. He has Asperger's. And I was horrible. And so that episode 3 weeks ago was the only idea of Asperger's that I had in my head. I didn't know anybody whose kids were on the spectrum. And so I was completely devastated. I mentioned that my parents lived 3 blocks away. My mom happened to call. I think it's mom ESP that sometimes happens when we know our kids are in trouble. And when I picked up the phone, she knew something was wrong, and my dad was at my door about 2 minutes later, and I just collapsed, and he did too, and it was just completely life-changing. Looking back now, it was jarring, and it took me way too long to learn enough and to become accepting of it. It took me years. I held that anger and that grief. I'm a planner by nature. I like to know what's going to happen and when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And this kind of set my whole plan completely. And we just took a 180-degree turn. And it took me a long time to come to terms with that. And I wish I had worked through it a lot more quickly than I had. I think we made probably a lot of mistakes in the beginning of our journey that to do over again, I would go back and change. But, the good news is that was a decade ago. He's 13 now. The one thing that we decided on day one, when my husband came home that night and I told him what my knowledge was, and he just said, then we just got to hit the ground running at 1,000 miles an hour and do as much as we can to give him the best quality of life that he can have. And that's what we did. And even without a diagnosis, I had from other contacts and online that he needed speech therapy and he needed occupational therapy and other kinds of things. And we just got on the phone and started getting appointments and evaluations. And, it's been 10 years now, and I can't even count them. My husband is a spreadsheet ninja, I like to call him, and he tried to keep track of all the therapies Brady had been doing on this spreadsheet. And after about a year, it was just a ridiculous amount of hours. He's like, I'm not even going to why would I even keep track of this anymore? But the other part of that though, is that it was fun for Brady. Brady was great with adults. So his major dysfunction from a social level was with peers. But if he could get one-on-one attention from an adult, he loved it. He thrived in it. And so these therapies with these qualified people who would sit down and work with him, they were all play-based, and he loved it. He never complained about it. He never really knew any different kind of life. So
yeah, that was you. I just want to say, you're saying, I wish I'd learned and accepted this faster. And I just want to say, oh, Mama, like, you're allowed to be human, you're allowed to grieve this and to have a hard time, because that's a really hard thing. That's a really, really hard thing. I don't know. I just want to, I'm hearing that in your voice, and I just want to say that, like, no one said you were going to be perfect, and it's okay for you to make mistakes.
Well, thank you. And I did. And I do look back now, and I had to get through that process, and it was my own path of getting through it. And it was a redirection of focus. So my focus when I was so upset and bitter was on me. It was that my plans had changed. My perfect little life that I had planned for wasn't working. Things were harder than I wanted them to be. I wanted to just have I wanted to take him to soccer practice. That's a bad example because I hate soccer, but I wanted to take him to some kind of a regular kid activity rather than therapies, all day. And everything was focused on me. And when I finally started to focus on all the things he could do and all the amazing gifts that he does have, and that this path that he is on is exactly the path he's supposed to be on. And so is mine. And so once I was able to let go of that, and that's not to say that I don't still get my pangs of, wishing that his school path had been easier, those kinds of things that got really hard in finding a school that was appropriate for him and having kids not treat him the way that I would want him to be treated. Those kinds of things, I still wish I could change. But he's going to do amazing things. He's got unbelievable talents and creativity, and he's unbelievably loyal. He's unbelievably sweet. He wants to make people happy. I mean, we're very, very lucky to have the kid that we have. And so that was what I had to come to terms with.
Yeah, that's got to be hard. I mean, for me, the only thing I can relate to is this idea of, like, I had to come to terms with my anger, to be like, I have to accept that this crazy temper that, if you've listened to any other podcast,
yes,
is here, and I have to accept that it's here. I can't just pretend to be in denial that it's not here. Like, we kind of were, I don't know, I think in a lot of ways, like, we were taught by our culture to just, like, deny things, like pretend, don't cry, don't have these feelings, don't do this, whatever. And then when these feelings arise, and and you said you had anger, you had grief, we just feel like there's something wrong with me for even having these feelings.
Yes.
I'm sure, which makes it just even harder to get to this place of, like, oh, okay, these are here, I've got to process them. I've got to digest them somehow,
Absolutely. And, I think it was finding community too. Like, it was very isolating at first. Like I said, I didn't know anyone who had a child on the spectrum, and we didn't want to tell anyone because we didn't want people to react to even the term autism the way that we did, and have them play with our son or not want to have him in the classroom. And there were, unfortunately, there were parents that we dealt with that kind of attitude toward our son. And so we kept it a secret for a long time. We would come up, I can't tell you the number of times somebody would ask me something and I'd say, well, he's a little bit developmentally delayed, but we would never use even the word autism because we were afraid of what other people's connotation of autism was.
And can we I think this maybe is a good time to kind of pause and say, like, well, what is autism, right? Like you were
Mm.
saying, like we used to use the term Asperger's, we don't use that
Mm-hmm.
term anymore. We all use the term like on the spectrum, but what
Mm-hmm.
is the spectrum? And can you? I know you're a parent, not necessarily a pediatrician or an expert or scientist on this, but what's your understanding of this?
So, somebody with an autistic brain literally has different wiring in their brain. And so, things that maybe come naturally to some children, like the social aspect, if you're at a park and two neurotypical children see each other and they pick up a rock and they decide they want to play with the rock together, they'll be holding hands and asking their mom for a play date 5 minutes later. Well, Brady's social capabilities connect with other peers just aren't there. The wiring isn't in his brain. From a sensory standpoint, he feels things differently. And this took me a long time to understand. I would wake up, or after he got out of the crib, he would go into our couch. And we have these big down heavy cushions on our couch. And I would find him wedged in between the back of the couch and the cushion. And it's because he needed that pressure. He needed that sensory pressure on his body to calm himself down. Hot foods. We used to make chicken nuggets for him, and I would have to take him out of the oven and put them in the freezer for 5 minutes because they had to be cooked, but then they had to be room temperature. And I never understood that until he was old enough to share the language that he had learned, to say, what's room temperature to you is burning hot to me.
Hmm.
And so there are very real differences in the way he feels things, in the way he senses things, in emotional regulation, in very extreme interests. So when he was 2, before we were familiar or had any idea about autism, he was obsessed with the Wiggles. I don't know if you remember the Wiggles, or your kids might be too young to know the Wiggles, but the Wiggles were a group of 4 Australian men that would sing and dance, and they had other characters on their show. But Brady was obsessed not with the actual show itself. He wanted it playing in the background, but he was obsessed with the DVD covers. So he would take the DVD covers and lay them out. I'm aging myself just by saying DVD covers, I realize on that. But he'd lay them out on the ottoman and stare at them intently, and finally got to the point where that wasn't enough, and he'd pull the insets of the DVD covers out and want me to cut out little pieces of them so that he could walk around with. So he wasn't processing the show. He was getting this very narrow focus on small individual pieces of the show. And so that's another characteristic. So go ahead.
Did these like I can relate to in some degree. My daughter has a chronic pain situation and feels things very differently, and it's been hard to understand and accept that, okay, like that feels like that to you, really? Okay. And I was just wondering, like, and for her, some of her sensitivity led to, she had extreme reactions and big, intense, multiple intense tantrums when she was little. And, really sort of was a big driver in the way me sort of changing, what I was doing too. But like, I imagine one of the challenges with Brady might be the sensitivity would probably lead to a lot of like tantrums as like stress relief for him, almost like. but
Absolutely.
but that must have been, was that something you were dealing with, one of the bigger challenges too?
Absolutely. And that is just a pure and simple overload. Like his brain he is receiving signals from the world that we're totally missing. So if we're in a crowded room, I could still focus on the conversation that you and I are having, even though there's conversations going around me. There might be an air conditioner, there might be music playing, and he has a lowered ability to be able to kind of filter things out. So especially in where there was just a lot of sensory input, that would send his brain into overload, and it would be a true fight or flight reaction. And sometimes it was both. It's kind of one of a very common symptom of autism is that they run, and they call it elopement. But when we would be in these play dates sometimes and the kids would be loud and they would have the TV on and stuff like that, I would have to chase Brady to the door. He would try to run away.
Wow.
And then if there were, transitions that he wasn't expecting, that he wasn't able to prepare himself for, then the meltdowns would come. And I think that's kind of a typical part of autism when it's presented in younger children, is that they just don't have any tools to regulate that overload and to be mindful, and to be able to talk themselves down from it. And that's actually practice that a lot of his therapists, from occupational therapists to speech therapists, try to institute with their autistic patients, is to try to take that step back and not allow their brain to just overtake their body and their emotions to such an extent that where, luckily for us, fortunately, he was really able to start regulating that at an age where he was still small enough for me to help control him. But I have friends whose children don't have that regulation yet. And when they go into one of those full meltdowns, they will get hurt. I mean, there's a true possibility of them being hurt. And not because the child has, any kind of antagonistic feelings toward their parent, but that it is an impulse that they can't control.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that, we want to do, right? When a kid's having a tantrum, we're just got to keep them safe, right? Keep other people safe, because there's like a lot of out of control things happening. But what if that child is larger, older child like that?
Right.
You come up with some major problems then. I mean, just tangentially and sort of maybe anecdotally, how are people with bigger kids dealing with that kind of thing?
Well, there's medications that are obviously scary to jump into for a lot of parents, and then it's therapies. It's trying to figure out what the triggers are. What are the things that are causing the overloads, and trying to, prevent and prepare for that. Like I said, we've been really fortunate with Brady. He has never lashed out. I actually talk about it in the book, but I was the one that Brady would lash out at when he would have a meltdown. And that was actually almost a little hard, because it was hard for other people to understand that things were as serious as they were. So my husband would go to work, and Brady and I would have a horrible interaction. And then by the time John would come home, and I'm a wreck, and I almost couldn't even explain how it started, what happened, what transpired. But we were able, through a lot of parent training, to start seeing, okay, what was the antecedent to this? What was the thing that caused it? What was the behavior that resulted? And then what was the consequence of the behavior? Were we rewarding the behavior by feeding into it more? Were we, kind of making the consequence that the behavior could be de-escalated? It was a lot of education, a lot of parent education for us. But I'm fortunate. We are so fortunate. Brady does not have an aggressive bone in his body to this day, and not even emotionally. So when he is presented with someone who is not kind to him, he doesn't even know how to not be kind back. He just, gets hurt. So that part is hard too.
Well, you just shared so many of these challenges that you had to deal with, that you had to step up to, that you had to accept, etc. I want to ask in a second about what are maybe some of the gifts that this autistic journey has given Brady, but I'm also curious about you. From what you're describing, it sounds like you're a stay-at-home mom, which is great that you guys had the resources for you to do that. But that could, staying at home with like an average, kiddo is insane making for
I
one
was
human being all the
actually
time. Or maybe
I was
maybe
a work at home
yeah,
mom. I was a work at home.
Yeah, how
So,
are you resourcing for yourself through all this?
Again, I'm so fortunate that my parents were 3 blocks away. So even before the diagnosis, my mom, I was a 401k financial advisor for companies. So I did a lot of my work just at home, but then I would go to the company and have meetings with committees. My mom just made herself 100% available to take care of him from the time he was a baby. I don't know how else I would have done it. My mother-in-law was helpful as well. My sister became and still is my son's best friend. She's Auntie Kimberly, and she assumed a whole new persona as Auntie Kimberly once Brady came into the world, and she provided a lot of support for us too. And then, fortunately or unfortunately, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden, I didn't even have to go out to meetings anymore. All the meetings went to Zoom, but I still needed to be in my office and have somebody, taking care of him and making sure he wasn't running in with his, his immediate needs and that sort of thing. But I was so well supported. But, the thing that I've found, and through the Kind Families podcast, I've met some awesome companies, and I think companies are becoming more and more aware now that their employee base is dealing with this, because the statistics of the number of kids with autism, ADHD, all of these invisible neurological differences, it's 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 kids now. So it is 100% possibility, if you have more than 5 employees, that you have somebody dealing with this in your company. And a lot of the larger companies are actually creating resource groups for parents of kids with special needs, and also for employees who are neurodiverse themselves, which is fantastic.
So
There's a gal from MasterCard that a friend of mine from college introduced me to, and they have 1,400 employees in their neurodiversity resource group. That I think companies are figuring out that if they've got good employees that they value and that they want to, keep, that they've got to apply some flexibility to work schedules so that therapies can be attended, and if there is an emergency at school, that someone can get away. And so I would just say, if you're not working for a company that's got that kind of flexibility, that there are some out there, and that maybe you need to spread your wings and see if there's somebody that could be a better support for you as a parent and as an employee.
Yeah, that's true. I just did a talk. I do, for human resources groups sometimes bring me in to do a talk. And it was a big bank company that also had an employee resource group for neurodivergent kids. So yeah, that was really cool. But how are you dealing with the stress? How are you dealing with the emotional buildup, with the demands on your attention, your heart, your mind? I mean, this is enormous.
Well, yeah, and I will say that through this whole experience, it actually was the biggest developer of faith in me. So I know that, a lot of people might not, have faith guiding their steps, but that was something that became hugely apparent to me, in that there was design behind who Brady is, and there's design behind who I am, and that I'm Brady's mom. So I was not paired with Brady as a mom by accident, and I was given all of the tools and resources that I need to be his mom from the fact that he was born. So my faith is extremely important to me, but then community is also super important. I mentioned how isolating it was at the beginning of the journey, and Brady's occupational therapist gave me a name of a mom who had told her, look, if you ever have a new mom come in with a new kid who was just diagnosed, give her my number.
That's
and
so great.
I was kind of like, oh, do I call? It was very uncomfortable, and I'm an outgoing person, but I didn't even have her last name. Her name was Amy. And I was like, hi, Amy. Miss Lisa gave me your phone number. She invited me to coffee with 3 other moms who had kids. I mean, so much like Brady, it was hysterical. But I went and met these ladies for coffee, and that was the first time that I felt like I was in a group where they spoke my language. I felt like, even my best friends and my family, as much as they love me and love Brady and want to be there for me, it was impossible for them to know what the day-to-day life was like.
Yeah.
But these ladies did. And I remember we were in a grocery store coffee shop, and I mean, within 5 minutes, I was just crying the whole time, because it was just such a relief to hear them tell the stories about their kids that were so much like mine. They became a real lifeline for me. And, now 10 years later, there's so many resources that are out there for parents that have kids with special needs. There's communities. One gal I interviewed on the podcast has a network of about 3,000 moms nationally, and they have connection circles for parents of kids with any kind of disability. That's a support group. There's Facebook Autism mom pages for your communities. In our community, we have a organization called Southwest Autism Resource and Research Corporation, and they have a mom support network. So therapists, I highly, highly recommend, if anybody's going through this, don't wait for that piece of it after you get all the things, therapies and everything lined up for your kids, because that piece of it, number one, you'll get tons of ideas from the other moms. Some of them will be good and some of them maybe not so good. I've chased after a lot of things during Brady's 10 years of after the autism diagnosis that I laugh about now, but they will give you that sense of community that you need when you're going through something like this. Just like I'm sure for your daughter, something that she's going through that I wouldn't have any experience with, so I could sympathize with it, but I couldn't tell stories that would resonate just directly to your heart about that. And that's the same thing that any mom needs to do who's facing those challenges.
Yeah. And dads too. You guys are in there
Absolutely.
too, so we're not leaving you out. You're dealing with these challenges too. I mean, that sounds, I've had, ages ago, kind of forget his name, but I had the director of the Fire Mountain Resource Center for kids who are really struggling, kids who are, dealing with drugs and suicide and things like that. But anyway, I asked him at one point, I said, like, well, what's the best thing we can do to prevent our kids from ever seeing someone like you in their lives?
Right.
And he said, and his advice was to have other parents to talk to and to have that support network, because it's like one of the most essential forms of self-care, to just know that we're not alone, and just the relief that we feel. It's so essential to human survival, right? That we not be alone. And so the relief that we feel is so, so enormous. And that I'm so glad that you found that.
Right.
Well, I don't want to leave this part out. Like, your son's autism, I assume, gave him some gifts that made him special and different from other kids. What are those things? Because I imagine there are parents who are dealing with all of those challenges, those early challenges, and it can be a scary picture, right? It can be a bleak picture, but I know it's not just challenges. There's more. So anyway, I was wondering if you could share some of that too.
Absolutely. Well, Brady has always been creative. I mean, it's interesting because there's a lot of focus, I think, in the autism community about STEM, about, they're going to be computer programmers or mathematicians or something. Not my son. Math is not his favorite thing, but he is super creative. He loves to write. He loves to write creative writing stories. I mean, from the time he was probably old enough to hold a pen in his hand and draw, he would draw these cartoonish type pictures and write stories. We would make take the pieces of copy paper and fold them over and staple them, and that would be his book, and he would write his book. And that turned into probably 150 stories that he's written since he was a kid. And the older he gets, the more engaging and kind of complex the stories have gotten, which has been really fun to watch.
That's so cool. And he wrote the foreword to your book.
He did.
He did.
And he he did that in one draft. So I didn't even really tell him what to do, but he knew about the book. And of course, I couldn't have written this book if he wasn't okay with me telling some of the stories in it. But he went and he brought it back and he said it in front of me. I'm like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. So
cool.
But he is absolutely obsessed with movies now. Thankfully, he's moved past the Wiggles, and he is now very firmly planted in movies, but very granular in the movies. So he is a movie critic, and he goes in, and when he watches something, he writes reviews that go into the cinematography and the editing and the character development and all the things that I don't catch when I watch a movie. And then he's got a memory like a steel trap. He will bring up to me a movie that we watched 3 years ago, and he'll go, Mom, remember in the movie when such and such did this? And I'm like, No, buddy, I don't remember that at all. You're the only person I know who could remember that. So anyway, he's got a great sense of humor.
Hmm.
I think he could have some musical talent, but he's more into the movies and he doesn't want to develop that now. And he's just a loyal, sweet kid. So, the thing that I wanted more for him than anything was just that he would have a friend, that would really bond with him and that those friendships would be important to him. And over the course of his life, he's met a couple of boys that one of whom is on the spectrum as well, and the other who's not, but they are like two peas in a pod. And those kinds of relationships for him, I watch him try to savor or take care of his friends' feelings over and above his own. So I know that he has this level of compassion that I know probably most 13-year-old boys don't have. He is somebody that I've never met an adult who has met him who doesn't love him. And we've got to work on the other teenage kids so that they can understand him. Because he's not, doesn't have a typical personality. He's quirky but I think anybody who takes the time to get to know him will just love him as much as everybody else does. So.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like how things are changing. Our picture of what autism is like. We hear stories like Brady, people who are so creative and have incredible memories. I just saw that a young woman with autism just passed the bar exam and is the first lawyer with autism, which is so cool. And I think that as we accept these differences and and work with them and help them and not pathologize this so much. It's really, things are changing. It's in a really beautiful way.
I agree.
So, what advice do you have for parents of newly diagnosed kids with developmental and neurological differences that would have maybe helped you back?
Well, the best advice I ever heard, and I wish I could remember who told it to me, but it was that number one, your kid is the same the day after the diagnosis as the day before. So just because this diagnosis is now in your hands does not change who that child is, what their heart is, what their brain can do. It doesn't limit their capabilities or their future. It just means that you're going to need to start to really vet out the strengths that your child has and develop those as much as you can. So, we learned early on math wasn't Brady's thing. I'm not going to go push him to go, be a mathematician. I'm going to try to develop the creative side. I'm going to help him, get a camp at a theater or do something like that that's going to develop those strengths that he has, while also trying to help him develop the skills that maybe he's not so good at yet, but that are required to be able to function really well in the world that's not made for him. So I would definitely say reach out to community and try to build that support group around you. The other thing I would say is don't put off an evaluation or diagnosis. That is your game plan. So it is not a death sentence. It's not something that you should avoid. That is your roadmap for how you can help your kid have the best possible life. Because once you have that in hand, then you can go start getting the help that your child will need. So I see time and time again, and it absolutely breaks my heart. It's one of the things that gets me even a little angry is when parents recognize that something is going on with their child, but they don't do anything about it. Because the earlier you can get interventions in some of these behaviors and patterns, the more help you can give them. And if they don't do anything about it, I've been acquainted with families who were asking me for referrals to developmental pediatricians or psychologists when the kid was 5. And at 12, they haven't done anything. And the kid is reeling. And he doesn't know why he's so different than the other kids. He doesn't know how to manage his emotions. He doesn't know all of these other symptoms of his neurodiversity are just raging war in his life. So that's my other thing. Don't be afraid of the diagnosis. That is your roadmap to know how best to help your child.
I love that. I think that's great. Yeah, I mean, the more awareness, the better. Yeah, there's going to be things to process and, but yeah, you can't go into if we're in denial, it's not going to help anything.
No.
That's for sure. Carrie, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I've been on your Kind Families podcast.
Yes.
Carrie is the host of the Kind Families podcast, and I'd love for you to just let people know about your book and where they can find you.
Absolutely. So the book is Finding Kind, and it's discovering hope and purpose while loving kids with invisible neurological differences. So that's the KIND acronym. The Kind Families
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
podcast.
whoa.
Sorry. Okay. Say it. Kids with invisible. Sorry about that. It rolls off my tongue like terminology used to. Now it's kind. So kids with invisible neurological differences. And
Yeah,
so
great. Okay, good.
so kind is very much, any kid that looks just like any other kid, but definitely has some different wiring going on in their brain. So it doesn't necessarily need to be autism. It's ADHD. It could be anxiety. It could be sensory processing, executive function, OCD, like all of these things that are just invisible to someone who would just meet your child on the street, but are real things that are going on in the way and maybe interfering or certainly impacting the way they are relating to the world. So that's where KIND comes from. And then the Kind Families podcast, I just try to interview people like you who have really good, helpful things to share with other kind families, whether it's providers or therapists, and sometimes it's just going to be other moms that relate to the path that they're on. And then Finding Kind has been a journey for me. I started writing it in 2018, actually. And we talked about the process I went through to really accepting Brady for who he is and all the wonderful things he can do. And in 2018, I wasn't there yet. So I wrote a lot of the stories then, and then last year had the opportunity to sell my business and really focus on Kind. And it really turned into and morphed into this story about, certainly becoming awakened to his neurological differences and then adapting to life with a neurodiverse child and then accepting him for who he is. And there's just some really fun stories about Brady and all of the really amazing things that he's done and continues to do. So that's the heart behind it. And then kindfamilies.com is the website.
All right, so go find Finding Kind anywhere you like to find books and
absolutely
listen to the podcast. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you again, Kari. I really enjoyed it, and
Me too.
Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Hunter. Appreciate it.